Next up, we'd like to transition into our second topic, which is on beneficial ownership transparency. And this answers the critical business question, who really owns that? We know that beneficial ownership transparency is a critical way to reduce corruption, combat kleptocracy, and ensure a fair and open competition for the private sector. And at SIPE, we applaud the painstaking work in recent years of building a consensus between business, government, and civil society on this issue. But of course, a lot more remains to be done on the issue. And to dive more deeply into this, I'd like to welcome Terry Jennings of Lexus Nexus to moderate our next panel. Terry, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And as head of rule of law development at Lexus Nexus, I work every day to support the company's core mission and vision to advance the rule of law around the world. We know through data that when the rule of law is strong in countries, other socioeconomic benefits to the country are also strong. So we know that GDP and life expectancy rise. We also know that child mortality and corruption decrease. In our discussion, the panel will discuss beneficial ownership transparency, which in its simplest form is how businesses can work to make transparent who owns and controls the business. And in fact, transparency is one of the 4 key elements of the rule of law. At the same time, the topic is an important balancing test with great rewards to both business and to the government when they are navigated well. Companies generate rich data, and sharing of data can be balanced and must be balanced with privacy and human rights. We need to understand these questions now, as the global pandemic has highlighted and underscored the need for a digital society and data. And we've got 3 wonderful experts to help us navigate both those questions and those answers. I bring to you today Lola Adekanye, who is the ethics first lead and handles anti-corruption, compliance, overseeing risk management and due diligence at SIPE. She is based in Nigeria, and she supports efforts in a dozen African countries. Also joining us today is Christina T., who is CEO of Cape CEMS Manufacturing, a mid-sized manufacturing company in Malaysia. Christina serves as the president of the Malaysian International Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and she is also the newly elected head of the International Chamber in Kuala Lumpur. And also we bring Melina Cruz, who is the founder and CEO of Homely, a home cleaning services company based in Mexico with a workforce of over 1,000, bringing a mostly female workforce from the informal to the formal work sector. So Lola, I would like to start with you. And from your perspective, working in a dozen countries around Africa, what difference does beneficial ownership transparency make to how business functions in a democracy?
Thank you so much, Terry. And it's indeed an honor to be here. I do want to say first that, it's such an encouragement from our standpoint, which is the Center for International Private Enterprise, to be talking about business communities' responsibility for strengthening democracy. I think because one of the things we don't do enough in the civil society world is we don't emphasize, the link between market-oriented values, upon which beneficial ownership transparency is hinged, actually, and democratic ideals. And I'm glad we've talked about that a lot in the previous panels. Beneficial ownership transparency, without a doubt, it's the kind of reform that offers quadruple wins in many societies, for civil society organizations, for the government, for citizens, and for the business community. And that's because it helps governments provide conditions that business leaders all over the world, and especially in low-income, high-growth countries where institutions often are weak in terms of regulatory institutions. And just to pick on 3 major conditions that would be ideal, that aligns with democratic ideals, but also enables markets to thrive. One of them is fair competition. We heard the last panel talk about that a lot. And, we in the industry will say, businesses need a level playing field. And to drill down further, with beneficial ownership transparency, a company can know who they're transacting with. They'll know who the clients are, because it helps you know who the natural owners of the companies that you're doing business with are. You might have heard of certain corruption scandals in Africa and countries like Nigeria and Ghana. They're colloquially called budget padding. Essentially, what that means is companies may not know who's bidding for public projects, who submits tenders. Why? Because the owners of certain companies might be the same people, and they might be bidding for public tenders and may be the ones who always win the tenders, but the names of the companies are different. And so without a level playing field, businesses are disadvantaged, especially small businesses that would not have the resources to conduct due diligence and do the kind of investigations that larger companies can. The second thing is accountability in the business community. I think one of the biggest obstacles to reducing corruption and reducing illicit financial flows globally is impunity. When companies and business owners and governments can evade sanctions or penalties, I think it sends a very, very dangerous message, because then it creates more opportunities for corruption. But at the same time, it's factually detrimental to businesses or to the business environment, because at the end of the day, in many African countries, complying and doing business with integrity can actually be factually detrimental to businesses, albeit in the short term. And then the final thing really is transparency. And that's kind of, a very obvious one. Without transparency, due diligence costs go up for large businesses and small businesses alike. Many companies are worried now because of the recent GIABA report that came out just this week on Monday. GIABA is the Financial Actions Task Force styled body for West Africa. And this is the thought leader organization mitigating money laundering, or helping industries mitigate money laundering and terrorist financing activity. And the GIABA report pointed out that in the West African region, the Nigerian financial system facilitated revenue flows of up to $36 million annually to the largest terrorist network in the region. And so with beneficial ownership transparency, industry experts, compliance professionals, and businesses, the private sector, would be better equipped to address these challenges, especially where you see $88.6 billion being funneled out of Africa through illicit financial flows, which really amounts to more than the GDP of all but 7 countries of the 54 countries in Africa. So with those 3 points, and there's so much more we can talk about, I think beneficial ownership transparency is critical, is significantly essential for the private sector, but we haven't yet started putting these in terms that the private sector will align with us on. And that's where SIPE is uniquely positioned to discuss and to work with the civil society on.
Thank you so much, Lola. And Christina, turning to you. When Malaysia adopted beneficial ownership transparency with the enactment of the Company Act of 2016, what changed?
When Malaysia adopted beneficial ownership transparency adoption Company Act 2016, for a start, all business sector, especially private industry, are nervous. Failure to meet the requirement may result in imprisonment of not than 10 3 million or both. So for post-adoption, company received very positive objective to improve the regulations in our corporate governance and to ensure our corporate ecosystem is free from illicit activities. It also helps to prevent money laundering, terrorism financing, and other serious finance crime. For our nation, I think beneficial ownership, transparency help to shine a light on the secret corporate structures that can be exploited to launder the process of corruption, hide conflict of interest, improperly win the lucrative government contract, and evade tax payments.
Thank you so much, Christina. So we've heard from Lola the need for beneficial ownership transparency and practicality from Christina. So Melina, can you walk us through, with your experience in Mexico, developing and building a home cleaning service business? It's quite labor intensive, dependent on government permits. How does beneficial ownership translate into your world?
Thanks, Terry. First of all, deeply honored to be part of the panel. And I'm going to try to be really crisp about the answer. I think there's two ways of answering these questions. The first one is we need to focus on people, right? So back in 2015, when we launched the company, there were actually no regulations for domestic workers in Mexico. So Mexico had not signed yet the ILO 189 rule that basically provides domestic workers with access to minimum wages and social benefits. And then the second one is actually, as you were mentioning, it's pretty hard for us as a Mexican entity to be facing with corruption when we're talking about the contractual cleaning services. So tenders and contracts were not always assigned nor won in the best way, right? So as I'm telling you, there's two ways of watching this, where in one side of the equation, we had no regulation on how to guarantee legal rights for people. And on the other side, there were also no regulations in order to avoid sort of these issues when you are having or fighting for a contract when you're a cleaning company in Mexico. But something we have to really make sure people know, it's that I think thanks to the pandemic and thanks to more regulations that have been going through the country, well, that has been changing a little bit, right? So now we have more regulations. Now Mexico has signed the agreement, and as you were saying, it were really intensive in labor in our company. So now we have at least a playground where we can be playing in a more fair way and where we can be providing these rights for cleaners. And on the other side, it's pretty ironic, right, that the cleaning industry was somehow dirty. And again, government needed to come into and have some regulations that would help us in order to have a more fair way to be able to gain these contracts or have access to these tenders. So it's been quite hard. But again, I think it's part of the evolution we are somehow living in Mexico, of government being more able and implementing more regulations in order to guarantee that we have a more democratic playground where it's easier for companies to be able to grow and for citizens to be able to get included.
Thank you so much, Melina. And so turning to that business role, I'd like to explore how beneficial ownership actually transforms and is used within the business itself. So Lola, you work with Insight and you help business leaders understand the importance of transparency. In your experience, what are some of the reasons why businesses might be afraid of or not yet supporting business or beneficial ownership transparency?
Thank you, Terry. That's a very important question that we were discussing at the Africa Business Ethics Conference, which ended today, actually. The truth is, right now, the efforts to adopt and implement beneficial ownership transparency reforms is primarily driven by the civil society organizations. And of course, the motivations for that align squarely with the organizational goals of civil society organizations around, strengthening democracy or promoting human rights, reducing corruption, what you might call altruistic causes in a sense. But businesses have an additional primary motivation for what they do, and it's essentially making profit. And I think that's really why I'm excited we're having this conversation, because we would now, in pushing beneficial ownership transparency reforms for all the great reasons that we've discussed, align those business motivations to make profit with, the motivations to strengthen democracy, build a clean ecosystem, like the previous panelists talked about. However, until now, the pragmatic challenges that businesses have with, aligning or adopting BOT or encouraging BOT reforms haven't yet been discussed. And I'll just highlight about 3 of them that we're hearing from across the region. And I believe this might be relevant in other emerging economies. One of them is the compliance burden. And there are other associated complexities as well. But businesses already have quite a certain level of compliance requirements, and to drill down a bit further, the regulatory environments in many countries are quite, in a sense, draconian and inefficient. So it's hard enough to get a license, as we were just hearing in Kenya, or permits to run a business in 6 months to a year, and add to that, the requirements to comply with beneficial ownership transparency reforms that comes with, the beneficial ownership registers that would require companies to keep up to date. So the compliance burden is one that businesses are worried about. The other challenge that businesses have raised is that transparency in some jurisdictions can actually be a risk to businesses. And this is the case in, like authoritarian regimes or countries where the institutions are weak or highly corrupt, or, and impunity exists or abounds. And then the final major, recurring challenge for both businesses and governments is the lack of resources. Governments don't really have the resources to implement beneficial ownership registers and make sure that they're effective. And I think one of the connecting issues to that is the fact that interagency coordination for many basic policy requirements aren't even there. And so this is an added burden for both businesses, especially businesses that are small and mid-sized, don't have the resource to comply with already existing regulations, as well as governments that also will pass this burden on to businesses, requiring them to comply. That said, however, I think these are things that can be overcome, and we're only starting to even learn about these challenges now. And so we can start to work with civil society to overcome these challenges with technology and with innovations. We can help the public sector develop the kind of efficiency that would make beneficial ownership transparency implementable and effective.
So Lola, I heard compliance burdens, risk to business, and a lack of resources. Let's flip the coin to the other side. And Christina, turning to you, you serve as the head of a large chamber of commerce in your country. Can you tell us whether you think that beneficial ownership transparency is actually making your country more competitive? And if so, how?
The ultimate answer is yes. While our company's Commissioner of Malaysia has enforced the Company Act 2016, which required company to obtain, report, and update the BO information in a timely manner. So with the BO transparency, it acts in the fight against the corruption and money laundering. It helps to detect and prevent the conflict of interest, and help in the enforcement of religious enrichment law. Besides that, it also adding value to the governance, integrity, accountability, and the transparency of our ecosystem. So most significant result after our 5 years beneficial ownership transparency Company Act 2016 adoption, Malaysia has emerged as an attractive regional hub for service in the last decade, with promising growth in the finance services, information and communication technology, manufacturing and logistics sector, among others.
Wonderful, Christina.
The Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint My Digital. So initiative launched in February 2021 is expected to be in the interest to position Malaysia as a high value added economy. So the World Bank Doing Business 2020 report has ranked Malaysia the 12th among 190 global economy and the second in Southeast Asia. So I can say that with the BO transparency, it had actually give our country a more competitive globally rank. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Christina. And Melina, turning to you, what is beneficial ownership transparency meant specifically for your own company?
So I guess it's a pretty interesting question, because I do believe we are increasing transparency ourselves. We try to do things different at Homely, right? So we are improving the lives of the people that live in the base of the pyramid. We're giving them financial inclusion, and we're actually providing everything for the people to be able to have something we call economic independence, which we do believe is a main component for that people to be able to break the circle of poverty they've been living in and play in a more fair or more equal democratic states. So by doing so, we're also somehow increasing transparency on the business side, right? So every time we get the chance to go to a potential client, perhaps we are the small players in the table, right? Sometimes we have to face as competitors of tenders for companies that have been in the market for, let's say, 20 years ago. But again, they're not actually following the rules or the regulations now that the government has implemented, or prior even the regulation, well, it was even harder, right? So there was no problem. So I think that by being the small players, but again, by being the players that are putting these issues in the table, we are again doing the whole aspect of winning a contract in the cleaning service.
Thank you so much, Melina. It sounds like you're saying, sorry, you cut out for a second. Could you please continue?
Yeah, totally. I think you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. So as I was telling you, for us, it would mean a more equal playground for companies to be providing services. And in the end, that is the way to enhance growth for every company in our industry. And we're trying to do so, even though we're the small player in the industry, by always being super transparent on the efforts we are doing.
Thank you so much, Melina. So basically, transparency is leveling the playing field, not just for your businesses, but for others that are starting out and trying to make their mark in the world. So in a lightning round, I'd love to come back to each one of you quickly and give your call to action to other businesses who might not be knowledgeable yet on beneficial ownership transparency, but could be. So Christina, let's start with you. What's your call to action?
So I think the democracy that we are talking here for the transparency is we would like to actually see democracy, being more effective social security in ESG, that's what we are talking about. And the most important thing is I would like to share that the only real prison is fear. And the only real freedom is the freedom from fears. So I think let's move forward the democracy with faith and trust, and to build trust among the businesses is tremendously important, because we are going everything on digitalization now. If we cannot build trust via the virtual life, I think a lot of business cannot be dealt accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And Melina, what would be your call to action?
I think as business owners, we have two things. The first one is be able to have collaboration with government to deliver proper regulation that will help to shape a better democratic state. And then the second one is focus on the people. In the end, businesses are not just companies having contracts with other companies, right? So there's people behind those companies, the suppliers, customers, service providers, workers. So we should actually be leveraging on the knowledge of people and bringing everyone to the table of democracy, because that's the only way that we can have a healthy society and guarantee that we're going to be improving everyone's life in a democratic state.
Brilliant. Thank you, Melina. And Lola, for you, what is your call to action to others?
I have just one call to action, and I'm giving this call from the perspective of one who works in the African region, where the institutions really do need the support of private sector to be strengthened. And it's simply this: don't wait for the government to act. Don't wait for the government to push reforms. Don't wait for the government to set global standards or fix the democratic norms and standards that you want to see. Start working on it in your industry and with other companies in your sector. Just like Dr. Jade Simi said during the last panel, private sector does have to change the paradigm of how things are done, and then encourage and enable the government to step up. So in all of the countries where we work, if we want stable democracies and more transparency, more accountability, don't wait for the government to set the regulatory standards. At ABEC, we just talked about self-regulation. Every business should have a responsibility to fix the way they operate, just like we heard from all the other panelists from the Philippines and Ukraine during the last call, and try to get more businesses to think like them. I like what the moderator asked. He said, how can we make more business leaders like you? And that's what we need. The more business leaders we can have in our different countries who will uphold democratic norms and values, the better we'll be going forward. And I think we're on that path now.
Wonderful. I thank all of our panelists for your wonderful discussion. We talked about fear. We talked about risk. We talked about a lack of resources, but we've also talked about the positive side, about how beneficial ownership transparency can transform a business individually, Melina, and also an industry and a country, Christina. We have an adage that we say very frequently within my own company, which is that these efforts are not only the right thing to do, but they're good for business. So on that message of hope, I turn it back to you, Andrew, for the next panel.
Thank you, Terry, and all of our panelists for that fascinating discussion. While we know the hurdles for business for adoption of ownership transparency are present, it was really heartening to hear that the benefits for business and democracy are clear. And I think ultimately that's a good news story. We know that moving forward, the private sector, government, and civil society continue this work of advancing beneficial ownership transparency, so that from investors to entrepreneurs, to policymakers, and to citizens at large, we all benefit from the business when business competes on a level playing field of knowledge.